And believe it or not, over the years, I think people just assume Las Vegas is going to be more expensive than Reno. But in reality, I tell people all the time, if you're trying to make your housing more affordable, especially if you're younger people, I know my son does this and some of his friends as well. So the biggest factor in cost of living in any area is, of course, so you're thinking about moving to Reno, Nevada, and you're not quite sure what the cost of living is here compared to where you might live. Well, today we're going to talk about all things cost of living, whether it's housing, utilities, gas prices, so you can figure out what the cost of living might be here compared to where you currently live. And stick around to the end where we're going to talk about the number one biggest factor that affects cost of living here in Northern Nevada, and we're going to compare it to all the other major U.S. cities all around the West Coast so you can see what it costs to live here versus where you might be now. So if you want to learn more things about Northern Nevada and specifically what it's like to live here in the Reno, Tahoe area, the lifestyle, and all the fun things that happen here, by all means, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll get the notifications. We put out great content and new videos every week. So make sure you're following along so you can stay informed, and you can reach out to us anytime with any of your questions. So today's video, we're going to talk about the cost of living here in Northern Nevada and specifically in Reno Sparks. So there's three main points we want to talk about and explain and answer to you in great detail. And the first one is, what even is the cost of living? I know sometimes it seems easy to understand, but I always have a hard time figuring out how they calculate these things. So number two, of course, is how do we calculate cost of living? And number three is how do we compare from one city to another. So what does it cost to live in Northern Nevada? And again, specifically, we're going to talk about Reno and Sparks. But before we do that, I want to quickly explain what the cost of living even is and how we actually figure that out. So we did a little research, we looked it up online, and the definition of cost of living is the amount of money required to cover necessary expenses to maintain a certain lifestyle standard in a particular place. So we're talking about necessary expenses, which can include things like housing and food, gas and transportation, healthcare costs, taxes, and there's lots of other things that we're going to go in as we go through this video. But when they're talking about a cost of living is linked specifically to your income. And that's how they use it to compare the livability of one city to another, because obviously prices vary. If you travel around the country, you'll see the prices of a lot of things we're going to talk about today are not the same, and they're very specific to the city or region you live in. You can easily compare the cost of living between two cities by using a cost of living calculator. There are lots of them online. The one I like to use is what's called bankrate.com. They have a really good calculator. We'll put the link in the description so you can see it. And what you're able to do then is enter the city that you live in and then enter Reno, Nevada. So if you're thinking about moving here, that's perfect. You can also then compare multiple cities, but then also ask you to put your income in there. And you can use a sample income. It doesn't really matter. But from there, you're going to be able to see for a specific income what the cost of living is in one city compared to what it is in another. So let's say you made $75,000 in Reno, Nevada. How far would that $75,000 go in another city that maybe is less expensive? They use an index. Most of these cost of living indexes are based upon the 250 to 300 major metropolitan areas, and they take averages. And so 100 represents the actual average of these cities and regions, and then you get numbers assigned to you. So if your number is actually above 100, then you're actually above average. And if your number is below 100, then you're less average. So I just want you to see how we come up with these things. And again, it's not just bankrate.com. You can go to a few other websites as well. Let's go into some details now. So the first thing we're going to talk about are utilities. And you can get all kinds of different numbers and specifics on utilities. But the average monthly costs I found online were anywhere between $154.89 and $171.07. And that was for gas and electricity. And so, of course, depending upon the house and number of people living and all those kind of things, the information can be all across the board. So you're also going to have a trash or garbage bill. It's typically about $20 a month. You usually pay it quarterly. They have big trash cans. They have little trash cans. So usually I think when I used to pay quarterly, it's about $55 a quarter. I currently now have a smaller trash can, so I pay a little bit less. Then you're also going to have your water bill. And so water bills can vary greatly as well. In the wintertime, a standard water bill is going to be anywhere between $25, let's say to $35. In the summertime, it can be upwards of $100. And of course, a lot of that again depends on how many people live in your house. So how many showers and how much dishwasher and how much laundry you're doing or how much grass you have. So some of these numbers you kind of have to look at with a little bit of variability in them depending on what your situation is. But utilities here on that scale was literally a little under 100 on the cost of living spectrum. So we're very affordable as far as utilities go. One of the next big factors is gas and transportation. Gas around here at the time of shooting our video has been roughly around $4.25 to say $4.50 here in the Reno Sparks area. Those numbers, again, I drive a diesel car, so my gas is a little bit different than those. Depending on whether you're using premium gas or just regular gas, those numbers can vary. But in Washoe County, which is Reno and Sparks, our gas tends to be a little more expensive than all the surrounding areas, specifically because we pay a little extra taxes on our gas and they use that money to do new roads and to do all the road repairs. So at least we know what those funds are going for. But if you happen to be in the surrounding areas, and especially I spend a lot of time driving down into Carson City, in those areas, gas can literally be anywhere from 25 to 50 or 60 cents a gallon less. So again, it's one of those things where some people live in South Reno and your gas expensive and you just drive 20 minutes down the way into Carson City and that gas is going to be a lot less expensive. So again, for those of you, depending on how much you drive or how much you need your vehicle, around the country, if you look at cities like LA, gas was $6+ a gallon there. In my travels around the country lately, I've seen gas anywhere from $3 a gallon upwards of $7 a gallon. But I think as an average, again, we were right around average for what the country is. So another huge category that I get a lot of questions about is healthcare. The healthcare statistics are a little bit more challenging, a little more hard to find. We looked up some things. They talk specifically about family doctor visits or optometry visits or going to the dentist. All these numbers were pretty par on average around the country, but if they said an average doctor visit was $129.11, an average optometry visit was a little over $115, an average dental appointment was a little over $118. But again, all these things are more for just regular visits. I always tell people all the time, you never know how great your healthcare is or your healthcare insurance is until something bigger or more major happens. But as I looked at our cost of living indexes on a few different websites, again, we were very on par as far as costs around the country were. And our healthcare system and the number of hospitals and places that you can go has really grown in the last 10 years. So forever I know, and I typically like to talk to, say, people that are more my parents' age that are using the healthcare system maybe a little bit more for things. And every one of them, one, feels really great about our healthcare system, and two, feels like the costs involved in our healthcare system are very fair as well. It's like all the other numbers we've been talking about, it is right just above 100 on that cost of living scale. So the costs are very fair compared to other parts of the country. So one of the biggest factors in cost of living, again, is food. It is obviously a huge necessity. And I feel like this one has the most variability of all the categories, to be honest with you. The index showed us at 102.3, so we're just 2.3% over the average. But as I researched this, they really would even go into detail specifically, for example, as a bottle, I called it a bottle of milk. I call it a gallon of milk. They were saying in Reno, the average price is $4.60. But I'm telling you, you could shop at Winco Foods, which is a discount grocery store, or you could go into Whole Foods and you could literally spend twice as much in one versus the other just on, a gallon of milk. So when they start talking about eggs and potatoes, they gave you specific dollar amounts of what an average cost of those things are in our area. They were talking about $4.21 for a dozen eggs, $13.98 a pound for steak, or almost $6 for ground beef. On this list that I found, it said potatoes were $4.50, but I recently bought a 5-pound bag of potatoes for $3. So again, these numbers kind of jump all over the place. They were listing things like lettuce and bananas and orange juice. And I just kind of feel like depending on, one, do you eat a lot at home or do you eat out a lot? I just think food and the costs involved in, again, either making food at home or eating out is one of the biggest ways we can change and affect someone's cost of living. This is just kind of depends on your current situation. Daycare. So this was one where I honestly was having trouble finding a specific cost of living index number. I did talk to a few people and we were talking about daycare expenses. And I know people that have spent as little as $600 or $700 a month. I know people that spend more like $900 to $1,400 a month. And again, the reason why there's so much variable on this is kids that are younger. So if you have infants or 1 or 2-year-olds, the number of kids allowed in a classroom versus the number of teachers are there, it might be 2 to 1 or 4 to 1, versus if your kids are a little bit older and they can have 10 or 12 or 14 kids in there per teacher, the cost will vary greatly. Now, I know for me, my kids are now in their 20s, but I always remember, and I don't know anyone who has daycare or expenses that says, oh, wow, those seem like they're really inexpensive no matter where you live anywhere in the country. So as an example, one of my good friends has kids that are age 2 and age 5. They are in full-time 40-hour-a-week daycare because both the parents work, and he's literally paying $2,500 a month for daycare expenses. Sometimes you're going to have to, balance daycare versus work. Just know it's not going to be inexpensive. And I know when I talk to my brother, or I have some cousins that live on the East Coast that have similar age kids, and it's just expensive everywhere. So if you're somebody who's been thinking about buying a home in Northern Nevada, and specifically in Reno Sparks, I know some people are very concerned maybe they missed the market, prices are too high, or the cost of living has just become unaffordable here. Well, if you click the link, we have a guide that talks about, one, ways we can structure a really good offer, and to let you know what we can do to make sure that you don't feel like you've overpaid for a house and that you're comfortable with the monthly payment that you have. So hit the link, fill out the information, we'll provide the guide to you, and we can help you get the information you need to make a smart decision about buying a home in Northern Nevada. So the biggest factor in cost of living in any area is, of course, housing. And whether you're buying or you're renting, it doesn't make a difference. You have to get this line item correct. Otherwise, your cost of living is going to be a problem. And in Northern Nevada, the average price for a home is $560,000. So I know that is typically more expensive, I think, than people think it's going to be, but you can find a home for much less. You can find condos for much less if that's what fits in your budget. We're getting ready to list a nice little 2-bedroom condo for $250,000. So there are ways to get into our market that's going to be much more affordable for you than trying to spend something in that mid 500 range. Now, again, if you're someone who can afford to spend $1 million or $2 million or much more than that average, then that's totally fine for you. And you're probably not as concerned about all the details of cost of living. But for this particular video, it is the biggest factor in what affects cost of living here in Northern Nevada. So the other option, obviously, other than buying is renting. And in my research, I found that the average rent in Northern Nevada is $1,631. I found numbers anywhere typically between about $1,550 and $1,700. So of course, depending on if you're renting an apartment or a house or what amenities come with these particular locations that you're looking to rent, the prices will vary quite a bit. But on average, a studio apartment was going to be $1,120. And then these 1-bedroom through 4 bedrooms, it didn't specifically say whether an apartment or a single family home, but I'm going to assume the 1 and 2 bedrooms are apartments. A 1-bedroom was $1,330 on average, a 2-bedroom was $1,680 on average, and a 3-bedroom was $2,390, and a 4-bedroom was $2,860. So you can see those prices are all over the board, and depending on what your needs are, they can vary greatly depending on what you need. Now, I tell people all the time, if you're trying to make your housing more affordable, especially if you're younger people, I know my son does this and some of his friends as well, is they're renting a 3-bedroom house with 3 people in it, so they can get that price down. I know some people near the university have definitely done a lot more of the 4 and 5 bedroom places where they'll get 4 or 5 renters in there. My son's friends have rents anywhere between, say, $500 and $800 a month, but that's going to be living in someone's extra bedroom and then, of course, sharing a kitchen and all those kind of things. So there are lots of options as far as the rental stuff goes. So if we're buying, what we always get a question a lot about is property taxes. And property taxes in Northern Nevada are roughly 1 to 1.1%, and they are not based off the sales price. I know a lot of people that move here from California, they are based off the sales price. And I have said this for years. I would try to explain to you how our property taxes are calculated. We've even had people come into our office meetings, and it is so confusing that I just let people know that it's basically 1 to 1.1% of what the assessed value is. Now, with that being said, we did a video about this a while ago where we took 3 homes that were all valued at $675,000, and any homes in our area that are, say, built 20, 30, 40 years ago or more, their property taxes on average are going to definitely be lower than a similar priced house that the house is, say, 10 or 15 years old. And usually it's almost double. For a primary residence, what happens is there's a 3% per year cap on how much they'll raise your property taxes. And because of that, these older homes that were bought long time ago, because they only have that 3% per year increase, it takes a long time, and it's a hard way for them to get their taxes caught up to, say, someone who may have just bought a house last 5 or 10 years. And that's why you'll see these huge fluctuations in people's property taxes. Again, some of that comes into, if you say, I want to buy a $675,000 home, that principal, interest, taxes, insurance payments might be $300, $400, $500 a month different based upon a lot of different factors in an HOA as well. So it's just something to think about when you're figuring out all those cost of living things. The cool thing about Nevada and cost of living is this: we have no state income tax. We're only one of 9 states that doesn't have income tax. So that for a lot of people is beneficial on their income levels. And we also have a relatively low sales tax of 8.27%. So compared to a lot of the other cities, our sales tax is also quite low. So all cost of living indicators are all based upon City A versus City B, and then they're based upon income. And what they're trying to do is estimate if you make the same amount of money in one city, do you need to make more or less in another city? So now as we're going to compare Reno to other major West Coast cities, the median income that we looked up online for Reno was $67,557. But for this cost of living video, we're going to just average it out to $75,000. So as we're comparing one city to another, we can see what those numbers are. So one of the cities that we get compared to most, of course, is Las Vegas. And believe it or not, over the years, I think people just assume Las Vegas is going to be more expensive than Reno. But in reality, even though they're close, it is not. $75,000 in Las Vegas, you need to make $78,267 in Reno, so which is actually about 4.4% higher cost of living in Reno, and the housing is almost 10% more in Reno as well. So it is a little bit more expensive here, and what we're going to do right now is we're going to compare Reno to every other major West Coast city, and I think you're going to be surprised and see that we're actually relatively cheaper than most of these West Coast cities. But imagine if you made $75,000 in most of these places. We're going to let you need to know what you make in Reno for a very similar cost of living. So another city that's not very far away is Sacramento. And Sacramento is about a 2.5 hour drive. It's just over the mountains. We get a lot of people moving here to Reno from the Sacramento and surrounding cities there. But in Reno, if you made $66,596, that would be the same as making $75,000 in Sacramento. And of course, the cost is 11.2% lower for living in Reno than it would be in Sacramento. And housing's a whopping 15.2% lower. So now if we go further south into California, we're going to talk about Los Angeles. And as you can imagine, Los Angeles is way more expensive than it is to live in Reno. So in Reno, if you make $55,455, which is 30.1% lower cost of living, and housing was just a shade under 50% lower, it's a major difference. And so when we get people moving from Southern California, they think we're really affordable. If we go to the Bay Area again, we have San Francisco, which on all our lists was the most expensive place on all of these. So in Reno, if you make $44,211, which is a whopping 41.1% lower cost of living than San Francisco, you can see why people from California keep moving here, because we're so much less expensive. And housing was over 61% lower than it was in San Francisco. The next city that we're going to go to is Portland, Oregon. And I was surprised by this one. I did not think that Portland would be dramatically more expensive than Reno, Nevada, but it was. If you make $63,596 in Reno, that's like making $75,000 in Portland, which was 15.2% lower cost of living in Northern Nevada. And our housing was 25.1% lower, which I was shocked to see that. I thought Portland would be relatively similar. If you go a little further north up into Seattle, Washington, this was not a surprise. You only need to make $52,735 in Reno, which is a 29.7% lower cost of living than that $75,000 will make you up in Seattle. And our housing was 42.6% lower, which was not a shock at all. The next two cities that we're going to talk about, which I was not surprised with, which are very comparable to Northern Nevada, are Salt Lake City and Boise, Idaho. I know realtors in both of those locations, and we talk pretty regularly because cost of living is similar, pricing is similar, the weather is similar. And so, for example, first, Salt Lake City is just slightly more expensive. You need to make $72,992 in Reno, which was 2.7% lower cost of living here. And our housing was just 1% lower than Salt Lake City. And in Boise, the numbers were $73,398 in Reno and Northern Nevada, which was just 2.1% lower cost of living. And our housing was 3.5% lower. Both of those are cities that are drivable, just like the Bay Area was, but they're much more affordable. And the reason being is you see people from California going to Salt Lake and Boise and some of these places as well. The last city we're going to talk about on the West Coast is Phoenix, Arizona. And I was actually surprised that Phoenix is slightly cheaper than Reno. So in Reno, you have to make $75,791 in order to be making the same $75,000 in Phoenix. So obviously it was really small. It was only 1.1% more in Northern Nevada than it was in Phoenix. And housing there was 2.3% cheaper than it was here in Reno, Nevada. So you can see cost of living, the biggest factor, if you notice through all these cities, is always going to be the housing factor and the rent factor. And so if you can get that number on your line item dialed in, whether you're buying a house or renting a property, that is going to be the biggest way to affect cost of living in any of these communities, because most of them, the average of all the other things like utilities and daycare and food and gas, one, we're all pretty similarly cost, and one, I think, can be a little more easily fixable than if all of a sudden you have a $3,000 a month rent or your house payment's astronomically big. You can use these other factors in order to make those changes, but you got to get your housing situation proper. So depending on what city you're in and you're thinking about potentially moving to Northern Nevada, or maybe you want to compare 3 or 4 different cities, just go to bankrate.com. You can type in cost of living calculator, and it's really easy to put in there. You just put a salary in there. You can use your actual salary if you want, or just pick a number like I did to make it easier to navigate. And then you put in an income and whatever cities you want, and you can do the same comparisons that we did here on this video. So just again, bankrate.com, the link will be in the description below. So if you're looking for more information about potentially moving to or living in Northern Nevada, we've got a great video that you can go check out that tells you about all the amazing features and why you might want to move to Northern Nevada.